The rain poured down in icy sheets as Thomas Kendrick cycled through the narrow streets of Lisbon on January 23, 1943. The leather bag slung across his chest felt unusually heavy today, not from the letters and packages inside, but from the weight of knowledge no ordinary postman was meant to possess. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid morning air as he pedaled harder, his eyes constantly scanning the shadowy doorways and alleys. The 42-year-old postal worker had memorized every brick, every cobblestone on his route through the Portuguese capital, a city now overflowing with refugees, diplomats and spies as the fires of World War II raged across Europe. He slowed his bicycle as he approached the nondescript apartment building at Rua da Prata 67, his trembling fingers reaching for the bundle of letters in his bag. What happened in the next 7 minutes would alter the course of Allied intelligence operations across the continent. Thomas dismounted, adjusted his postal cap, and made a decision that violated every protocol in the Postal Service handbook. No one in the British intelligence community knew that one postman's seemingly insignificant choice that rainy morning would unravel the largest German spy network in Europe and potentially save thousands of Allied lives. Thomas Kendrick had not been born to the world of international espionage and counterintelligence. His story began 42 years earlier in the small fishing village of St. Ives, Cornwall, where his father mended nets and his mother worked at the local bakery. The oldest of 5 children, young Thomas grew up in a modest stone cottage overlooking the harbour, where fishing boats bobbed in the gentle swells of the Atlantic. His childhood was marked by simple pleasures, helping his father with the nets, collecting seashells along the shore, and delivering fresh bread from his mother's workplace to neighbours too elderly to make the trip themselves. It was these early delivery routes that perhaps foreshadowed his future career. Thomas was a curious child, always asking questions about the travellers and summer visitors who came to their small coastal town. "Why do you always talk to strangers, Thomas?" his mother would ask, with a mixture of concern and amusement. "Because everyone has a story worth knowing," he would reply. This natural inquisitiveness, combined with an exceptional memory for faces and details, made him stand out among his peers at the small local school. When Thomas was 17, his father's fishing boat capsized during a sudden storm. The tragedy left the family without their primary breadwinner, forcing Thomas to abandon his education and seek full-time employment. He found work at the local post office, sorting mail and occasionally delivering packages on foot throughout the village. His reliability and attention to detail quickly earned him praise from the postmaster. "You have a gift, Thomas," the elderly postmaster told him after 6 months on the job. "You remember every address, every name, without even checking your logs. The Royal Mail Service needs men like you." By 1923, at the age of 22, Thomas had secured a position with the Royal Mail in London, where his methodical nature and extraordinary memory continued to impress his supervisors. The bustling metropolis was worlds away from his quiet fishing village, but Thomas adapted quickly, finding satisfaction in the ordered routine of postal work. He took night classes in languages, developing proficiency in French and later Portuguese, driven by a love of learning he had never abandoned despite his truncated formal education. When the opportunity arose in 1937 for a special postal liaison position at the British Embassy in Lisbon, Thomas applied immediately. Portugal's neutral status made it a critical hub for international mail routing, and the embassy needed someone with impeccable credentials and language skills. His appointment came just as Europe was sliding toward conflict, though no one could have predicted how valuable his placement would become when war finally erupted 2 years later. After arriving in Lisbon, Thomas quickly integrated himself into the local community. He rented a small apartment near the harbour and spent his free time wandering the city's ancient streets, memorizing its layout and observing its rhythms. He began delivering mail along routes that included numerous embassies, consulates, and the residences of diplomats. His unassuming presence and official postal uniform granted him access to buildings that would otherwise be highly restricted. People barely noticed the middle-aged Englishman delivering their mail, which made him virtually invisible, the perfect cover for what would eventually become his second unofficial duty. Thomas married a local woman, Maria Santos, in 1939, just months before Germany invaded Poland. The couple lived modestly, and to all appearances they were simply an unremarkable postal worker and his wife trying to maintain normalcy as the world descended into chaos. What his neighbors didn't know was that Thomas had begun to notice patterns in the mail he delivered, peculiarities that his methodical mind flagged as unusual. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between the Allies and a catastrophic intelligence failure. By 1942, Portugal had become one of the most crucial neutral territories in the European conflict. Situated at the westernmost edge of the continent, its capital Lisbon served as the last open gateway between Nazi-occupied Europe and the free world. The city had transformed from a sleepy Iberian port into a teeming center of espionage, where operatives from both Axis and Allied powers conducted their shadow war under the thin veneer of diplomatic protocol. The historical context of Thomas Kendrick's actions cannot be understood without appreciating Lisbon's unique position during World War II. Portugal's dictator, António de Oliveira Salazar, had declared neutrality when war broke out in 1939, walking a precarious diplomatic tightrope between his country's ancient alliance with Great Britain and the economic pressures exerted by Nazi Germany, which desperately needed Portuguese tungsten for its war machine. This official neutrality transformed Lisbon into what many called the capital of espionage, where agents from all belligerent nations operated with relative freedom. For the Allies, Lisbon's importance extended beyond intelligence gathering. It served as the primary evacuation route for thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. Jews, political dissidents, and downed Allied airmen all made their way to Portugal, hoping to secure passage to Britain or the Americas. The city's harbor was filled with ships bound for New York, Rio de Janeiro, and London, carrying human cargo desperate to escape the European inferno. The British intelligence services, MI5, MI6, and the newly formed Special Operations Executive maintained substantial operations in Lisbon, often operating under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy. Their primary concerns were threefold. First, to monitor Axis shipping and submarine activities in the Atlantic. Second, to establish escape routes for Allied operatives and downed airmen. And third, to counteract German espionage efforts targeting Britain and its allies. The German Abwehr, their military intelligence service, had established an equally significant presence in the Portuguese capital. Under the direction of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the Abwehr had created a network of informants and agents throughout the city. Their primary mission was intelligence gathering about Allied shipping convoys in the Atlantic, information that would be passed to U-boat commanders, resulting in devastating losses for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. By early 1943, the tide of the naval war was beginning to turn against Germany. Allied convoy protection had improved, and the U-boats were finding it increasingly difficult to locate and attack shipping. The German High Command grew desperate for better intelligence about convoy routes and timing. They poured resources into expanding their Lisbon operation, creating what would later be codenamed the Iberische Spinne, or Iberian Spider, a vast network of agents spread across Portugal and neighboring Spain. What the Germans didn't realize was that the British had begun to penetrate their intelligence apparatus, thanks in part to the Ultra program, which had cracked the German Enigma code. However, the Allies were still missing crucial information about the structure and personnel of the Lisbon-based spy ring. British intelligence estimated that the network included at least 40 agents, but they had positively identified only 7. The remaining operatives continued to transmit valuable information about Allied movements, resulting in continued shipping losses that couldn't be afforded as the Allies prepared for operations in North Africa and eventually the invasion of Sicily. In London, the Admiralty was growing increasingly frustrated. In a classified memo dated December 12, 1942, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound wrote, "The continued leakage of convoy information from Lisbon represents an intolerable threat to our Atlantic operations. Every ship lost delays the build-up of forces necessary for upcoming campaigns. The source must be identified and neutralized with extreme urgency." What neither the British intelligence chiefs nor the German Abwehr realized was that the key to unraveling this deadly spy network would not come from sophisticated code-breaking or traditional espionage tactics, but from the observations of a humble postman whose only special equipment was his exceptional memory and unwavering attention to detail. As Thomas Kendrick continued his daily rounds through Lisbon's winding streets, he was noticing patterns that would soon bring the entire German operation crashing down. The first anomaly Thomas noticed was so subtle that anyone else might have dismissed it entirely. It began in October 1942, when he observed that certain addresses on his route were receiving an unusual volume of mail from seemingly unrelated sources throughout Portugal and Spain. The envelopes bore different return addresses, postmarks from various cities, and appeared to be written in different handwriting styles. Yet Thomas, with his meticulous attention to detail, recognized something odd. The weight and dimensions of these envelopes were remarkably consistent. "Something's not right about these letters," he mentioned casually to his wife Maria one evening as they sat in their small kitchen. "6 different senders, writing to the same 4 addresses, and every envelope feels exactly the same weight in my hand." Maria looked up from her mending. "Perhaps they're business correspondence, Thomas. Invoices or statements would be similar, no?" Thomas shook his head. "Business letters come in company envelopes with printed addresses. These are all handwritten, all on the same quality paper, and they're going to apartments, not businesses." Over the next several weeks, Thomas began paying closer attention to these particular deliveries. He noted that they arrived with predictable timing, always 3 days before major Allied shipping convoys departed from British ports, information he gleaned from overheard conversations at the British Embassy, where he delivered diplomatic pouches twice weekly. One of the addresses receiving these suspicious letters was a third-floor apartment at Rua da Prata, 67. The recipient was listed as Miguel Santos, no relation to Thomas's wife, ostensibly a Portuguese art dealer. Thomas had delivered mail to him for nearly a year and had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with the man, who spoke Portuguese with a barely perceptible accent that Thomas, with his ear for languages, couldn't quite place. In early December, Thomas noticed another peculiarity. When delivering mail to the apartment building where Miguel Santos lived, he spotted the supposed art dealer entering the rear of the German consulate through a service entrance, unusual behavior for someone who claimed to have no diplomatic connections. These observations might have remained private suspicions had Thomas not developed a casual friendship with James Westfield, a junior attaché at the British Embassy, who was in fact an MI6 officer operating under diplomatic cover. Their relationship had begun innocuously. Thomas delivered diplomatic pouches to the embassy, and Westfield often received them, offering Thomas a cup of tea and friendly conversation. On December 28, 1942, during one such delivery, Westfield mentioned the grim news about a recently sunken convoy. "Bloody disaster in the Atlantic again," Westfield said, shaking his head. "Second convoy this month hit exactly where we didn't expect U-boats to be waiting. Someone's feeding them information, but damned if we can figure out who." Thomas hesitated, uncertain whether to share his observations. As a postal worker, he was bound by strict confidentiality rules regarding the mail he handled. Yet as a British citizen watching a war that threatened his homeland, he felt a competing obligation. "Mr. Westfield," Thomas said carefully, setting down his teacup, "I may have noticed something unusual in my postal rounds, probably nothing, but—" Westfield's casual demeanor shifted subtly. "What sort of unusual?" "Thomas?" Over the next 20 minutes, Thomas outlined his observations about the pattern of similar letters arriving at specific addresses just before convoy departures. He described Miguel Santos and the man's suspicious visit to the German consulate. Westfield listened intently, asking occasional questions but revealing nothing in his expression. When Thomas finished, Westfield simply thanked him for the information and promised to look into it. He then added, almost too casually, "I'd appreciate if you continued to notice any such patterns, Thomas, and perhaps keep our conversation between us." What Thomas didn't know was that his observations had electrified British intelligence. Within 24 hours, a coded message had been sent to London, and MI6 had begun quietly investigating the addresses Thomas had identified. Surveillance was established, but maintained at a distance to avoid alerting the suspected German agents. By mid-January 1943, British intelligence had confirmed that at least 3 of the addresses Thomas identified were indeed linked to German intelligence operations. However, they still lacked concrete evidence about the content of the communications and the full extent of the network. The information being leaked was still leading to Allied shipping losses, with a particularly devastating attack on January 18th that sank 7 merchant vessels carrying supplies for the North African campaign. The pressure to unravel the network was mounting, but British intelligence faced a dilemma. Moving too quickly might alert the Germans and cause them to simply shift their operations elsewhere. They needed more information, specifically the content of those suspiciously consistent letters and the identities of everyone involved in the network. On the evening of January 22nd, Thomas received an unexpected visitor at his modest apartment. James Westfield arrived unannounced, his expression grave. "Thomas, I need to speak with you privately," he said when Maria answered the door. In their small living room, Westfield revealed his true role as an intelligence officer and explained that Thomas's observations had been invaluable but insufficient. "We need to know what's in those letters, Thomas," Westfield said quietly, "and we need to identify everyone involved in this network. Lives depend on it. Thousands of them." Thomas stared at the intelligence officer, immediately understanding what was being asked of him. "You want me to intercept the mail," he said flatly. "That would violate every oath I've taken as a postal worker. It's not just against regulations, it's against the law." Westfield nodded gravely. "I know what I'm asking, and I wouldn't ask it if the stakes weren't so high. This isn't about regulations, Thomas. It's about stopping information that's sending our sailors to their deaths." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened streets of Lisbon. "If I'm caught, I'll lose my position. I could face imprisonment. If you're caught, we'll protect you," Westfield promised. "But you won't be caught if you're careful. No one notices a postman, Thomas. That's why you've been able to observe so much already." After hours of discussion and soul-searching, Thomas agreed to help. The plan was simple but extremely risky. The next day, when suspicious letters arrived for delivery to the addresses under surveillance, Thomas would divert them briefly to Westfield before completing their delivery. British intelligence would open them, photograph their contents, reseal them with special materials designed to hide any tampering, and return them to Thomas for normal delivery, all within the time frame of his regular route. As Thomas lay awake that night beside his sleeping wife, doubt gnawed at him. His entire professional life had been built on trust and integrity. Now he was preparing to violate that trust. Yet he also thought about the ships being sunk, the men drowning in the cold Atlantic waters, and the war effort being undermined by the very information passing through his hands. By dawn, his resolve had hardened. He would do what was necessary, consequences be damned. And so, on that rain-soaked morning of January 23, 1943, Thomas Kendrick found himself approaching Rua de Prata 67 with the weight of impossible choices bearing down on him as heavily as the icy rain. The bundle of letters in Thomas's postal bag felt like they were burning through the leather as he approached the rain-slicked steps of the apartment building. His heart hammered against his ribs, and for a terrifying moment, he wondered if his nervousness would be visible to anyone watching. He forced himself to move with the same methodical routine he had followed for years, checking his delivery log, organizing the mail for the building's residents, maintaining the precise rhythm that had made him unremarkable and therefore invisible on his daily rounds. Among the various envelopes and small packages was a letter addressed to Miguel Santos, bearing a Seville postmark and written in the same distinctive handwriting Thomas had come to recognize. It matched the pattern of suspicious correspondence he had been tracking, the same weight, the same quality paper, the same timing relative to Allied convoy movements. Thomas entered the building's dim lobby, nodding to the elderly doorman who barely glanced up from his newspaper. Instead of proceeding directly to the bank of mailboxes as he normally would, Thomas made a slight detour, slipping into the narrow maintenance corridor that ran alongside the lobby. James Westfield had told him that an MI6 operative would be waiting there, disguised as a maintenance worker. The corridor was poorly lit, smelling of mildew and floor polish. "Delivery," Thomas whispered, feeling ridiculous using such an obvious code word. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in worker's overalls with a toolbox. Without a word, the man took the bundled letters Thomas extended, tucked them into his toolbox, and handed Thomas an identical bundle. 10 minutes, the man murmured. No more. Same place. Thomas continued his route through the building, delivering mail to all apartments except those receiving the suspicious correspondence. He climbed the stairs slowly, timing his rounds to ensure he would return to the maintenance corridor at precisely the right moment. Each step, each letter delivered to legitimate recipients, felt like an extension of his normal routine, yet never before had such mundane actions required such concentrated effort. 9 minutes later, Thomas returned to the maintenance corridor, where the disguised operative wordlessly handed him the original letters. They now bore the faintest signs of having been opened and resealed, signs that Thomas doubted anyone would notice unless they were specifically looking for them. He slipped these back into his postal bag and proceeded to complete his deliveries, including the now examined letter to Miguel Santos. As he slid the letter into Santos's mailbox, Thomas half expected alarms to sound, or the building to suddenly fill with German agents. But there was only silence, broken only by the distant sound of the doorman coughing in the lobby and the patter of rain against the windows. Thomas continued his rounds, forcing himself to maintain his usual pace and demeanor, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to rush, to flee the building as quickly as possible. When he finally emerged back onto the street, the rain had intensified. Thomas mounted his bicycle and continued his route, delivering mail to 3 more addresses on Westfield's list, using the same interception technique, with different MI6 operatives stationed along his route. By noon, he had completed his deliveries and returned to the postal depot, soaked to the skin, but having successfully diverted and returned all the targeted correspondence. What Thomas couldn't know as he went about the remainder of his day, trying to act as if nothing unusual had occurred, was that the contents of those intercepted letters would send shockwaves through British intelligence and ultimately change the course of the secret war being waged in neutral Portugal. Inside a secluded room at the British Embassy, James Westfield and a small team of intelligence officers pored over the photographs taken of the opened correspondence. The letters appeared to be innocuous personal communications or business inquiries written in Portuguese, Spanish, or French. However, when examined by cryptographers, they revealed a sophisticated code embedded within seemingly ordinary text. "It's a book cipher," explained one of the cryptographers, a bespectacled woman who had been a classics professor at Oxford before the war. "See these numbers scattered throughout the text. They appear to be page numbers, line numbers, and word positions, but we need to know what book they're referencing." That reference book was identified within hours, a specific edition of Don Quixote that had been distributed to German agents throughout the Iberian Peninsula. Once the code was broken, the content of the messages became clear. They contained detailed information about Allied shipping, convoy compositions, departure times, routes, and escort strengths. One letter, sent from a fishing village near Porto, included precise observations of a Royal Navy destroyer group that had briefly anchored offshore, information that would be invaluable to U-boat commanders planning ambush positions. Most alarmingly, the decrypted messages revealed that the network was far larger than British intelligence had suspected. The 4 addresses Thomas had identified were merely collection points. The letters referenced at least 27 other agents operating throughout Portugal and Spain, gathering information from dock workers, hotel staff, railway employees, and even compromised staff at Allied embassies and consulates. "This is far bigger than we imagined," Westfield told his superior, a silver-haired man known only as Colonel Harris. "It's not just a local operation, it's a comprehensive intelligence network covering the entire peninsula. And based on these communications, they're planning something significant for the convoy scheduled to depart Glasgow on February 3rd. Colonel Harris studied the decoded messages, his expression grim. "If this information reaches German hands, that convoy won't stand a chance. We're talking about 38 merchant vessels carrying supplies critical for the North African campaign, escorted by just 7 warships. A coordinated U-boat attack with this level of intelligence would be catastrophic." "What are your orders, sir?" Westfield asked. Harris was silent for a long moment, weighing the options. "We have 2 choices: roll up the network immediately, or feed them false information through these channels. Both have risks. If we arrest them now, we alert the Germans that we've compromised their system, Westfield noted. They'll simply establish new networks and we'll be back at square one. But if we try to use their network against them by feeding false information, we risk them discovering the deception, Harris countered. And we'd need someone with ongoing access to their mail, someone they would never suspect. Both men reached the same conclusion simultaneously. They needed Thomas Kendrick to continue his postal interceptions, but now with an even more dangerous mission, he would need to deliver altered letters containing misinformation designed to lead German U-boats away from actual convoy routes. That evening, Thomas was summoned again to meet with Westfield and Colonel Harris in a safe house on the outskirts of Lisbon. When they explained what they needed from him, Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "You're not just asking me to intercept mail now," he said quietly. "You're asking me to participate directly in an intelligence operation against the Germans. If they discover this, they would consider you a spy," Harris confirmed bluntly. "Not protected by any diplomatic status. The consequences would be severe." Thomas thought of Maria, of the life they had built in Lisbon, of his 20 years of unblemished service with the postal authority. Then he thought of the convoy, 38 ships carrying thousands of men, sailing into what would be certain destruction if he refused. "How would it work?" he asked finally. The plan they outlined was precise and extremely high risk. British intelligence would create duplicate letters matching the originals in every detail, but with subtly altered coded information about convoy routes and timings. Thomas would deliver these forgeries while the originals were retained as evidence. The operation would require split-second timing and nerves of steel. "You don't have to do this, Thomas," Westfield said gently. "You've already done more than could be expected of any civilian." Thomas looked down at his hands, postman's hands with paper cuts and ink stains, hands that had sorted and delivered thousands of letters without ever questioning their contents. He thought about how these same hands now held the fate of countless sailors in their grasp. "I'll do it," he said simply. "Tell me when to begin." The operation commenced on January 26th, and for the next 3 weeks, Thomas lived in a state of constant tension. Each day, he intercepted coded messages from the German spy network, allowing British intelligence to track the network's activities while simultaneously feeding false information back through the same channels. The forgeries were masterpieces of deception, containing just enough accurate information to maintain credibility while providing critically wrong details about convoy routes. Thomas maintained his normal routine, delivering mail along his route with the same methodical precision he had always shown. To his neighbors, to his supervisors at the postal service, even to his wife, he appeared unchanged, perhaps a bit more tired, a bit more distracted, but still the same reliable Thomas Kendrick who had delivered their mail for years. Inside, however, he was in turmoil. Each time he approached one of the drop addresses, he felt exposed and vulnerable. Each time he made the exchange with the disguised MI6 operatives, he expected to feel a heavy hand on his shoulder, to hear the dreaded words, "You're under arrest." At night he lay awake beside Maria, unable to share the burden he carried, listening to every sound outside their window, wondering if this would be the night the Germans came for him. The climax of the operation came on February 2nd, the day before the Glasgow convoy was scheduled to depart. Thomas had just completed a delivery to the apartment on Rua da Prata when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Miguel Santos himself was in the lobby, engaged in conversation with the doorman. Thomas had never encountered the German agent face-to-face during a delivery, and for a heart-stopping moment, he feared Santos had somehow discovered the deception. Thomas kept his head down, clutching his now empty postal bag as he moved toward the exit. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard Santos call out to him, "Ah, the postman, a moment of your time, please." Thomas turned, forcing a neutral expression. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Santos approached, smiling pleasantly. He was a trim man in his 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of deep tan that came from spending time on the water. "You are Thomas Kendrick, yes? The regular postman for this route?" Thomas nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir. For several years now." Santos studied him with penetrating blue eyes. "I've been expecting some important correspondence." Has anything arrived for me today? I believe so, sir, Thomas replied, amazed at how steady his voice sounded. I just placed a letter in your box. From Seville, if I recall correctly. Santos continued to study him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then he smiled again. You have an excellent memory for your deliveries, Mr. Kendrick. It's my job to be thorough, sir. Indeed it is. Santos reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope. A gratuity for your excellent service. Thomas hesitated. Taking tips was against postal regulations, and accepting anything from this man felt particularly wrong. That's very kind, sir, but it isn't necessary. I'm just doing my duty. Duty is important, isn't it? Santos remarked, still holding out the envelope. Especially in times like these. There seemed to be a hidden meaning behind the words, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with his rain-dampened uniform. Was this a test? Was Santos suspicious? Yes, sir, duty above all. Thomas finally accepted the envelope, tucking it into his pocket. Thank you. I should continue my rounds now. Santos nodded. Of course, good day, Mr. Kendrick. As Thomas left the building and mounted his bicycle, he could feel Santos watching him from the doorway. He pedaled away at his usual pace, resisting the urge to speed away, even as panic clawed at his chest. Had he been discovered? Was the entire operation compromised? He continued his route, making 2 more scheduled interceptions before finally reaching the British Embassy, where he immediately reported the encounter to Westfield. He was testing you, Westfield concluded after hearing Thomas's account, but I don't think he suspects. If he did, you wouldn't have walked out of that building. What was in the envelope? Colonel Harris asked. Thomas had forgotten about it entirely in his anxiety. He withdrew it from his pocket and carefully opened it. Inside was a generous amount of Portuguese escudos and a small card with handwritten text. For your continued discretion with my personal correspondence. Harris and Westfield exchanged looks. It seems Mr. Santos values his privacy, Harris remarked dryly. Fortunately, he has no idea just how indiscreet we've been with his mail. The modified letters had their intended effect. On February 10th, British naval intelligence intercepted German communications, revealing that a wolf pack of 11 U-boats had been positioned to intercept the Glasgow convoy, except they were waiting 300 nautical miles north of the convoy's actual route, which had been changed based on the successful deception operation. The convoy reached its destination in North Africa without losing a single ship, delivering vital supplies for the Allied campaign against Rommel's forces. For Thomas Kendrick, however, the danger was far from over. The operation had succeeded, but the German spy network remained intact and operational. British intelligence now faced a critical decision: continue the dangerous game of deception, potentially saving more convoys but risking eventual discovery, or use the evidence they had gathered to dismantle the network entirely. The decision was made on February 15th, when Thomas reported that Miguel Santos had begun watching him with increased suspicion. During a delivery, Santos had casually mentioned that he had spoken to workers at the postal depot and learned that Thomas sometimes took unusual detours on his route. "It's time," Colonel Harris announced, when Thomas reported this disturbing development. "We can't risk your cover being blown. We move tonight." In a coordinated operation involving British intelligence, Portuguese police, and American OSS agents, 34 members of the Iberian Spider Network were arrested simultaneously across Lisbon. Miguel Santos was taken into custody as he attempted to destroy documents in his apartment. The evidence gathered through Thomas's postal interceptions provided irrefutable proof of espionage activities against the Allies, compelling even the officially neutral Portuguese authorities to act. The significance of the operation extended far beyond the immediate arrests. The intelligence gathered from the seized documents and subsequent interrogations revealed German submarine deployments, agent networks throughout neutral countries, and encryption methods used by Abwehr operations worldwide. Admiral Canaris's entire Iberian intelligence apparatus had been compromised, dealing a severe blow to Germany's ability to track Allied shipping in the crucial Atlantic supply routes. For Thomas Kendrick, however, the aftermath was bittersweet. His direct involvement in the operation had to remain absolutely secret. While British intelligence had coordinated with certain trusted elements within the Portuguese police, the full extent of Thomas's role could never be acknowledged publicly without putting him at risk from remaining German agents or sympathizers. The morning after the arrests, Thomas resumed his postal route as if nothing had happened. He cycled past the apartment building on Rua da Prata, where police tape now blocked the entrance. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, whispering about the midnight arrests, completely unaware that their unassuming postman had been instrumental in bringing them about. When Thomas later crossed paths with James Westfield on the grounds of the British Embassy while delivering diplomatic mail, the intelligence officer merely gave him a subtle nod, their agreed-upon signal that all had gone according to plan. There would be no medals, no public recognition, not even a formal acknowledgement of his service. The greatest victory of Thomas Kendrick's life would remain known only to a handful of intelligence officers and himself. In the months that followed, Thomas continued his postal duties throughout Lisbon. Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic declined dramatically as German intelligence from the region dried up. The North African campaign progressed successfully, followed by the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Each Allied advance was supported by convoys that now reached their destinations with significantly reduced losses, convoys protected in part by the actions of one observant postman. Thomas and Maria remained in Lisbon until 1945, when the war in Europe finally ended. With peace declared, they decided to return to England, where Thomas took a position with the Royal Mail in London. His personnel file contained a cryptic notation, "Rendered special services to the Crown, 1943 Lisbon Station," the only official acknowledgement of his extraordinary contribution to the Allied war effort. On a rainy afternoon in April 1962, nearly 20 years after the events in Lisbon, an elderly Thomas Kendrick sat on a park bench in London, watching children play. A distinguished gentleman in a well-tailored suit approached and sat beside him. "Good afternoon, Thomas," the man said quietly. Thomas turned, momentarily confused, then broke into a smile of recognition. "Mr. Westfield, it's been quite some time." James Westfield, now considerably more grey but still possessing the same alert eyes, nodded. "Indeed it has. I heard you retired last year. I thought it was time I delivered something to you for a change." He handed Thomas a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a leather-bound first edition of Don Quixote, the very book that had been used to encode the German spy messages. "Open the cover," Westfield suggested. Thomas did so, finding a handwritten note inside. "To the postman who delivered us victory, with the enduring gratitude of those who know. Admiralty Intelligence Division, 1943. Thomas stared at the inscription, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the words. "I never expected any acknowledgement," he said quietly. "That's precisely why you deserve it," Westfield replied. "We've calculated that your actions saved approximately 23,000 Allied lives, sailors and soldiers who would have been lost if those convoys had been intercepted." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "I was just a postman doing what seemed right." "That's the thing about heroes, Thomas. The real ones never set out to be heroic. They simply do what's necessary when faced with a choice between action and inaction, between courage and comfort." They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the children play. Finally, Thomas asked, "Whatever happened to Santos? Miguel Santos?" Westfield's expression darkened slightly. "He was eventually exchanged in a prisoner swap in 1944, returned to Germany. After the war, he was identified as Colonel Kurt Müller of the Abwehr. He died in 1958 in East Germany." Thomas nodded, absorbing this information about the man who had come so close to discovering his secret activities. "He almost caught me, you know, that day with the envelope." "But he didn't," Westfield said simply, "because the best agent is the one nobody suspects, the one hidden in plain sight, carrying out their mission with quiet determination, while the world looks right past them." The irony of Thomas Kendrick's story lies in its stark contrast to conventional notions of wartime heroism. While military histories celebrate the daring commandos, the ace fighter pilots and the brilliant generals, They rarely mention the ordinary men and women whose small acts of courage altered the course of conflicts from the shadows. Thomas never fired a shot in anger. He never parachuted behind enemy lines or led a cavalry charge. His weapon was his postal bag, his battlefield the rain-slicked streets of Lisbon, his victory achieved not through force, but through observation and moral courage. In the decades following the war, as classified documents were gradually declassified, hints of the Lisbon postal operation began to emerge in historical accounts of wartime intelligence activities. A brief mention in Sir William Stevenson's 1976 memoir, A Man Called Intrepid, referred to a postal worker whose keen observations unraveled a major Axis intelligence network in the Iberian Peninsula. A footnote in the official history of British naval intelligence acknowledged that unconventional assets in neutral Portugal provided crucial counterintelligence that significantly reduced shipping losses in early 1943. Yet the full story remained largely unknown, overshadowed by more dramatic tales of espionage and special operations. Thomas himself never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews about his wartime activities. When occasionally asked by neighbors or colleagues about his experiences during the war, he would simply shrug and say, "I delivered the mail. Rain or shine, the mail had to go through." Perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement came in 1967, when Thomas and Maria were invited to a small, private ceremony at the Admiralty. There, in a wood-panelled room overlooking the Thames, Thomas was presented with a simple silver medallion bearing no inscription, a token known only to members of British naval intelligence as the Silent Service Award. Admiral Sir David Clutterbuck, who had been a junior officer during the North African campaign, shook Thomas's hand and said simply, "You saved my ship and every soul aboard her. We never knew who to thank until now." Thomas returned to Cornwall after Maria's death in 1971, settling in the same coastal village where he had grown up. He lived quietly in a small cottage overlooking the harbour, often walking along the same shores where he had collected shells as a boy. Few, if any, of his neighbours knew that the elderly man who fed the seagulls each morning had once been instrumental in one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of World War II. In 1982, a graduate student researching British intelligence operations stumbled upon references to Thomas in recently declassified files. After months of searching, the student finally located Thomas in Cornwall and wrote to him requesting an interview for his dissertation. Thomas replied with a polite but firm refusal. "The past is best left where it belongs. There were no heroes in my story, only people doing what was necessary under difficult circumstances." Thomas Kendrick passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 12, 1984, at the age of 83. His obituary in the local paper made no mention of his wartime activities, noting only that he had been a postal worker for 43 years and was known in the village for his kindness to children and his remarkable memory for birthdays and anniversaries. A week after his funeral, attended only by a handful of villagers and distant relatives, a wreath of white roses appeared on his grave. The card bore no signature, only the embossed insignia of naval intelligence and a simple message. The letter was delivered. Mission accomplished. The full extent of Thomas Kendrick's contribution to the Allied victory remained classified until 1997, when the last of the relevant files were opened under the 50-year rule for wartime intelligence operations. A comprehensive analysis by naval historians revealed that the disruption of the Iberian Spider network had reduced Allied shipping losses by approximately 47% in the critical months leading up to the invasion of Sicily. Conservative estimates suggested that Thomas's actions had saved at least 74 vessels from destruction and prevented the deaths of over 23,000 Allied personnel. In 2005, a small museum exhibition in the Imperial War Museum in London finally brought Thomas Kendrick's story to public attention. Among the documents on display was his original postal route log from January 1943, open to the page where he had made a nearly imperceptible mark next to the address on Rua de Prata, the first breadcrumb in the trail that would lead to the dismantling of the German spy network. The most poignant artifact in the exhibition, however, was a water-stained envelope, the very one Miguel Santos had handed Thomas that February day when the German agent had come so close to uncovering the operation. Beside it lay the card it had contained, with its unintentionally ironic message: "For your continued discretion with my personal correspondence." What makes Thomas Kendrick's story so powerful is not merely what he accomplished, but how he accomplished it. In a war defined by unprecedented technological and industrial might, by massive armies and devastating new weapons, it was the human element, observation, intuition, courage, that proved decisive in this critical intelligence battle. Thomas had no specialized training, no advanced technology at his disposal. His only extraordinary quality was his willingness to act when he recognized that something wasn't right, to risk his safety and career for a cause greater than himself. His story reminds us that history often turns not on the grand actions of famous figures, but on the quiet decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It shows us that courage wears many uniforms, sometimes even the humble grey jacket of a postman cycling through the rain on his appointed rounds. The legacy of Thomas Kendrick's actions extends far beyond the immediate military impact. The intelligence gathered from the dismantled Iberian Spider network provided Allied commanders with unprecedented insight into German operations throughout the Mediterranean and contributed significantly to the planning of both the Sicilian and Normandy invasions. The methods developed during the Lisbon postal operation influenced counterintelligence procedures for decades to come, with Thomas's technique of identifying patterns in seemingly routine communications becoming a standard approach in intelligence work. Perhaps most importantly, Thomas Kendrick's story serves as a powerful reminder that in times of moral crisis, the choice between action and inaction often falls not to those in positions of authority, but to ordinary individuals going about their daily lives. When Thomas noticed those suspicious patterns in the mail he delivered, he could have easily ignored them, convincing himself that it was none of his business or that someone else would surely notice and take action. Instead, he chose to speak up, to step outside the narrow boundaries of his official duties, to risk everything for what he knew was right. In doing so, he demonstrated a truth that resonates far beyond the specific historical context of World War II, that systems of evil and oppression depend not only on the active participation of true believers, but on the silent compliance of ordinary people who simply follow procedures, who look the other way, who convince themselves that moral courage is someone else's responsibility. As we contemplate Thomas Kendrick's choice on that rainy January morning in 1943, we might ask ourselves, what would we have done in his position? Would we have risked our security, our career, perhaps even our life to intercept those letters? Or would we have continued delivering the mail according to regulations, telling ourselves that it wasn't our place to question what might be inside the envelopes, and perhaps more importantly, what patterns are visible in our own daily lives, what inequities, what injustices, what moral compromises that we choose not to see because acknowledging them would require us to step outside our comfortable routines and take actions that might come at personal cost. The true power of Thomas Kendrick's legacy lies not in celebrating him as an exceptional hero, but in recognizing that his choice is one that presents itself to each of us in different forms and contexts throughout our lives. His story challenges us to develop the same qualities that made his actions possible: attention to detail, moral clarity, and the courage to act on our convictions even when easier paths are available. In a world that often seems overwhelmed by complex global challenges, the story of one postman in Lisbon reminds us that history can turn on the smallest of actions, that systems can be changed through the accumulated choices of individuals, and that the most profound impact often comes not from those who seek the spotlight, but from those who simply do what's right when given the chance. Would you have broken the rules as Thomas did? Would you have risked everything to intercept those letters? Or would you have continued your rounds following the regulations that had guided your entire career? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. The rain had stopped by the time Thomas finished his rounds that February day in 1943, the clouds giving way to a pale winter sun that cast long shadows across the cobblestones. As he cycled back to the postal depot, he passed children playing in the streets, merchants reopening their shops, couples strolling arm in arm along the waterfront, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that the letters in the postman's bag had just changed the course of the war. Thomas himself would go home that evening to Maria, would eat dinner and listen to the radio and sleep in his own bed, would rise the next morning and begin his rounds again as if nothing had happened. The world would not know for decades what had transpired that day, how the humble routines of one observant postman had unraveled the largest spy ring in Europe and saved thousands of lives. And perhaps that, in the end, is the true measure of quiet heroism, not that it seeks recognition, but that it does what must be done and then continues on its way, content in the knowledge that some letters, once delivered, can never be called back.